Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 News. The flexi-wing technical directive drama continues with reports emerging today that Red Bull's complaints about the rear wing of that McLaren during the Australian Grand Prix actually have no real basis in reality, and Red Bull simply have no idea what is creating that McLaren to be so fast right now, but it's certainly not the Mini-DRS effect according to some reports today. If this is true, and McLaren have to change nothing based on this going into the Chinese Grand Prix and potentially beyond, Red Bull and the other teams have a serious task on their hands to turn this season around. Very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I greatly appreciate it. Thanks, by the way, for all the support and the subscribers over the last few days. I massively appreciate every single one of you who even just likes the video or watches. I don't even mind. If you've never commented in your life, perfectly fine by me. If you're enjoying the content, and it's race week again. China is in a couple of days' time. Potentially, there could be a race week in Thailand at some point. There was a meeting between Dominicali and the Prime Minister of Thailand. We know that they've been looking to do a race in Bangkok, and of course, it would be a street race in Bangkok. This is the thing. Is Dominicali as bad as Ben Sulayem? No. But also, at the end of the day, it is about the money, and if Bangkok are coming along and saying, hey, we'll we'll do these plans, we will pay this to make it happen, then F1 may say, that sounds like a reasonably good idea. So Domenicali says that they have impressive plans to host a race in Bangkok. I am looking forward to continuing our discussions in the weeks and months ahead. Look, am I down to have more races more around the world in places like Thailand? Sure, but does every fan, do 85% of fans want permanent circuits that have some history and actually are good tracks more than street races? Yeah, they do. And we have some great races still on the calendar, sure, but I don't really think anyone's asking for another street track. If you're going to bin off Miami and take us to Bangkok, whatever. If you're binning off Spa, then, I'm going to have my concerns on the matter. Let's talk Aston Martin. Adrian Newey is there now, and he's putting in a shift. To be fair, the Aston was not bad in Australia. It wasn't great, but it wasn't an embarrassment. It wasn't Alpine 2024 start of the season all over again. Stroll got sixth at the end of the day, and Alonso was looking in position to potentially pick up some points as well before falling onto the gravel that Gasly had put onto the track and spinning off and causing the safety car that made the race all rather interesting. But Newey says, well, I don't think he actually said, Andy Cowell said that Newey is basically just working on 2026. He may have some small input on 25, and I think to some degree he has to understand what the team are currently doing in 25, because it's still ground effect next year at the end of the day. But the bottom line is, Newey is not going to be spending time fixing this season for Aston. He will be spending his time making next year the best possible machine that Aston can muster. Because on paper, they have all the pieces, Aston Martin, to deliver championship success. Let's be real. That is the goal of Lawrence Stroll. This weekend is the Chinese Grand Prix. I don't really know what this is, but it does appear to be a trophy of some sort. If you get pole for the sprint, this is what you get. So, yeah, I don't know. There you go. Congratulations, I guess. That's going to have pride of place on the mantelpiece. Whoever does get pole, Lando will be favourite to achieve that. Shout out Sauber as well and Hülkenberg, just because I was of the opinion that Sauber would struggle very, very heavily for points this year. Their car looks pretty woeful, really, in Bahrain compared to some of the other cars. It was actually the Haas in Australia, which was nowhere to be found on pace pretty much the entire weekend. So some questions on that. I do wonder a little bit whether it has something to do with the Ferrari situation, just because you tend to see that the B team, as it were, and Haas isn't exactly the B team, but they take everything they can from Ferrari within reason. And to be fair, they've not taken the front suspension this year, but they have taken other components, and there's a bit of a feeling that if Ferrari have, stumbled across issues that maybe they were not expecting, it also is likely to affect Haas as well, in the same way that the Racing Bull is better than I thought it would be, which maybe to some degree implies that the Red Bull is also slightly better than we may have thought it would be. Just something to keep in mind. But the fact that Hülkenberg has scored more points in the first race than Sauber did the entirety of last year, I do think it's plausible, though, that we have this same discussion halfway through the season and Sauber still have 6 points, right? Like, Australia was an anomaly for sure in terms of a race, loads of DNFs, the type of race that you can capitalise with some serious points. Some teams did, some teams did not, but those races don't tend to come along very often. It was just a welcome change to have one of them as the first Grand Prix of the season. Ferrari, on the other hand, they were the big losers in many respects. It's their worst first round performance since 2009 in terms of total points accrued. That can change. It's a very long season, but will Ferrari be able to pull off what McLaren did last year? It's certainly unlikely. It's possible, but it's certainly unlikely, and I feel like it was, to some extent, inevitable that the way that these teams were taking some risk this season, McLaren certainly took some risk with some of the pretty bold design choices they chose with their 2025 car. They took some risk. Red Bull took some risk as well. It doesn't really look like it. The car looks the same, but under the body, they definitely change an awful lot. Ferrari took some serious risk as well. In many respects, Ferrari probably took the most risk by changing the front suspension concept and the design that they decided to go with and the geometry of it. Honestly, I was surprised that Ferrari stuck with it last year. I thought going into 2024, and they nearly won the Constructors with last year's car, but I thought last year, if they were going to change it, then was maybe the time to do it. This year, it was a risk to change the geometry, and I'm not saying that's the only reason why they're struggling, but it's likely to be part of it. Of course, it's not the only piece. We've also got the communication between Hamilton and his radio engineer, his race engineer on the radio, not exactly being optimal, but they will learn in due course, and Hamilton and Bono in the early days were not always, let's say, singing from the same hymn sheet, as it were. But a long way to go for Ferrari right now, no doubt about that. Let's talk Lando real quick as we get onto this McLaren discussion, though, because Lando is, well, he's rubbing some people up the wrong way, and I understand it, but also I think this is how it goes. When a driver, look, I'm not saying Lando's going to be a dominant force. I think that there's still a few questions that I have about whether Lando has the capability to execute at a World Championship winning level, but this weekend in Australia it was much more impressive than we saw him on many occasions last year. But I think this is what happens, right? Lando starts to win and all of a sudden, you know, the haters come out the woodwork, as it were. But also, I kind of get it. I think there's some fans that would prefer Lando to be more honest with how good the car is, I guess. I mean, of course, there was a stint during the Grand Prix where Verstappen had absolutely no answer to the pace of the McLarens that simply drove off into the distance on tyres that were giving them substantially more grip than the Red Bulls were providing. But Lando, after the race, says there are so many questions in the media about the car, not everything is about the car, and that is clear, which of course is true. Lando wants a bit more respect, I think. The way that I read it is that Lando's here like, look, okay, sure, our car's the greatest right now, but he's not going to say, oh, our car's the best by miles. And to be fair, which driver ever is, let's be honest, going to say that. But Lando wants to play down the idea that it's the car doing all the work. And to be fair, I think that's kind of fair. Like, when Piastri and Lando both went off the track, and, you know, if Lando had gone off the track there, it would have been Max Verstappen winning the Grand Prix this weekend. But Lando did a better job than Piastri did, scrubbing off the speed, keeping it on the track. And, okay, maybe he shouldn't have gone off the track in the first place, but it was always going to be tricky when the rain hit when you're first, you know, the first man arriving to the scene. But Lando did a better job than Oscar in that moment, and that was the difference maker, really, between scraping into the points and actually winning the Grand Prix. So, just a small example, was it mostly the car as to why they were in a position to win the race? Sure, the car is the most important thing in Formula 1, everyone knows this, but the driver is also very important. And Lando's kind of riding the line between saying, yeah, sure, the car's great, but how about we talk more about me in terms of like how good I have been? And I also think that's fair enough, right? Like, I think drivers should have an ego. Like, they should be of the mindset that they are making a serious difference. And I think that's okay. But inevitably, it is going to rub some fans up the wrong way, especially when a few years ago, Lando was, when he was asked the question on Hamilton, when Hamilton was dominating, and, you know, Lando made the point that he should basically win every race because he's only got to beat his teammate, really, because the car was so good. That was, but of course, Lando, when he was in the title fight last year, swiftly came to realise that actually winning a title fight and executing consistently week in, week out, as Hamilton did for many years, as Verstappen has now done for many years, that is much more of a challenge, it seems, than Lando recognised. But maybe this year's going to be the one where he's going to separate himself from the pack in that sense. And Lando actually doubled down on this when he was talking about George Russell, right? So Russell made the point earlier in the weekends that he thinks that McLaren, they're so good, they're going to be so dominant, they can simply transition their focus to 2026 and ride off into the sunset this season. And Lando kind of shut that down and said, let's see, Max was 3/10 off yesterday. Last year, we were much further off and ended up with the best car at the end of the season. We were over half a second off at the beginning of last year behind Red Bull and ended up with the quickest car. I know George made some comments earlier this weekend that we can turn our focus to 26. If that's their mentality, wonderful, but that is not the mentality to have. Sorry, mate. We know we can still do a lot of work on this year's car, if you relax in this position, you fail. So I thought definitely very interesting from Lando to kind of call out George's mentality and say, look, George is, being a bit of a crybaby here. Like, there's still a long season ahead. Of course, it's always easier to say these things when you have the best car and are currently the championship favourites. Let's talk Red Bull, though, because they have been throwing, as Amos described, poison darts at McLaren. Whether any of them will actually land is a question mark. But, well, we'll discuss that more in a second. Firstly, I wanted to talk about Lawson because he had difficult is probably an understatement for his weekends. I think the tough thing for Lawson is that many of these first tracks that he's driving on, I think China as well, not Japan. Lawson's definitely driven at Suzuka before. I think he did like Super Formula and stuff over there as well. But he's not driven Australia before. He's actually one of the only drivers never to have done. And in what has always been and will likely continue to be a tricky car in the Red Bull, that was an issue for him. Now, Helmut Marko, he didn't slam him exactly as he kind of slammed Isaac Hadjar, but he did say this: we have to let him cool down a bit now and observe his development over the first 3 to 5 races. So I wouldn't exactly call it like a 5-race ultimatum. I think the point for Marko, if anything, is like, look, hey, Lawson didn't have a good weekends, but judging him on one race is too premature. Which is, it's literally his first Grand Prix. Red Bull are at least going to defend him for some time before probably eventually turning on him, because that's how Red Bull seem to go. Of course, one might argue that what Red Bull should really be saying is, Yuki did quite well this weekend. If Lawson keeps going like this, maybe it's time to make the swap. I'd be down to see it, I think, at some point if the current trajectory continues. I'd like to see how Yuki would get on. I still think he would have a hard time. It's just the nature of things. How good Verstappen is, the way the Red Bull is designed. There's multiple factors that make it let's just say, a poison chalice, as people say, for that second seat over there at Red Bull. And Lawson is likely experiencing that right about now. But they're going to give him some time, as of course they full well should. But Red Bull will be helped, and Lawson would be helped, if some of the other cars were pegged back to some degree. Yesterday, Eric Van Haren came out with an article suggesting that Red Bull are very upset, and the FIA reportedly not happy either, about teams playing around with flexibility of the rear wings again. Now, the rumour had it that they were going to introduce more strict flexibility tests, which they are going to do. And they are going to make them substantially more strict, going from the Chinese Grand Prix beyond. So the flexibility under a 750 Newton force, the limit of the flexibility is going to go down from 2mm to 0.5mm, with a further reduction to 0.25mm going forwards. So the theory is, and that's of course this section of the rear wing that we talked about in some detail in yesterday's video, that Red Bull believe was doing something a little bit dodgy. Now, I will say, all of the onboard footage I saw of this element here did not really, it wasn't conducive to making it clear that anything dodgy was going on, right? Like, you can't really see from any of the video footage that I've seen, there's much flexibility here. Now, this gap is fine and frankly inevitable. The debate is whether this gap is increasing at high speed. And if that's true, then, we're talking about Mini-DRS again, right? The video footage I've seen, if it does increase at high speed, it increases very marginally, I would say. But the FIA put sensors on the cars to test this, and they made the decision that going into China and beyond, they will be tightening up on this element. The question really becomes, is it going to do anything? Are the teams really vulnerable to this anyway? How are the teams going to solve it? There was talk about them, just finding some sort of, let's just say, homemade solution to potentially fix this issue with the new technical directive. But according to reports from AMUS, there really isn't anything to this from Red Bull's perspective, as in, they're not going to gain any advantage from throwing the poison dart, as was described. So AMUS, again, one of the most reputable sources in the Formula One world, and they said the following on the current predicament of the Red Bull. Lando Norris confirms we have found an even better balance with our car between fast and slow corners, between high and low downforce. That sounds alarming to Red Bull. They are desperately trying to figure out what makes the MCL39 so good. The key lies in answering one question: why does the car handle its tyres so well without paying for it during the warm-up phase? If you know that, you know everything. Red Bull, though, is following the usual pattern here in Formula One is the next part. So fundamentally, just to keep in mind, this Mini-DRS thing, it's obviously a conversation topic? Is it the one defining factor, even if McLaren are doing something which makes their car so good? No, there's obviously far more to it than that. That's what Red Bull are trying to find. But if Red Bull can find a way to peg their rivals back, they are going to do it. And they said the following AMUS, they shoot poison darts at the opponent, hoping to hit something. The complaints to the FIA, on the other hand, consume energy, and depending on the response from the FIA, one can narrow down the possible explanations through a process of elimination. So the point is, right, that Red Bull are going to throw darts. That's what AMUS are suggesting at various things that McLaren are doing. And based on what the FIA say about whether they try and clamp down or not, Red Bull can then narrow down what is actually causing the McLaren to be so good. So they are probably going to keep throwing darts at the rear wing, at the front brake duct, at the front wing, like all of these things. Red Bull are going to try and see what sticks, I guess. And is it, game theory optimal? Is that how I often describe Red Bull's approach? Sure. Is it a little bit cheesy? Maybe, but, this is sport. There's lots of money on the line. In Melbourne, it was the rear wings. The FIA technical department, however, could not detect anything suspicious during the static tests or the camera recordings. So, interesting statement, because they have decided that they will clamp down on this. They are going to say, look, we are going to make the flexibility tests far more strict, but it doesn't seem like, according to AMUS, they found much evidence to support the fact that anyone was doing it. They've just decided, okay, we'll clamp down anyway, maybe just to appease Red Bull. I don't know, so Red Bull get off their back, as it were. But, according to reports, yeah, the rear wing of the McLaren is legal. They will not have to change anything going forwards. But this is Red Bull's kind of master plan to eventually find out what McLaren are doing to give themselves such an advantage, right? So, and as people say, it would also be too easy to reduce the whole secret to just a detail. Horner sees the decisive quality of the McLaren in an incredibly balanced vehicle, which is very difficult to achieve with these ground effect cars. And Red Bull say that, look, they've got to find more downforce to get to this point so they can look after the tyres better than they presently are. Verstappen, it was pretty interesting, right? Because as he says, we were able to keep up with the McLarens for a while, but as soon as our tyres got too hot, they drove off and left us behind, especially at the end of the first stint. So, that really puts things into a bit of a microcosm as to where the competitiveness currently lies in the sport. But, definitely interesting to read this, right, that McLaren, the rear wing is fine, Red Bull are throwing the darts, and maybe in a few rounds' time, after they throw some more darts, they'll have a better understanding of what McLaren are doing to create such a decisive advantage that they seemingly currently have. And, on this evidence, it's going to be difficult to stop them. But things can and do change in Formula One. These were some of the numbers last year where Verstappen was, this I think was in the race, wasn't it? When he was half a second a lap faster. But in the sprint, you guys might remember that Verstappen had an absolutely obscene advantage in last year's Grand Prix and was cooking up like a second a lap quicker than anybody else. It wasn't that dissimilar in the sprint race either, and China is a track that will kind of exacerbate the performance advantages. Just the way that a track is, it's very challenging, I think, and you often tend to find the cars that are good, they really show it in China, and the cars that are bad, they really show it in China, just because such of the track is so challenging for the cars, certainly the first sector at times as well, and there's a big straight as well towards the end of sector 2. But, a year ago, roughly, Verstappen was miles quicker than the McLaren or anybody else around this track. Of course, this time around, it's a very different story. So Red Bull could bring it back, Ferrari could bring it back. I think Mercedes are in a nice position as well, because despite the fact that their car was substantially slower, sure, and they've definitely got some, let's say, performance defines, they're currently tied with McLaren in the Constructors' Championship. That is a better start of the season that they have had for quite some time. So very much interested to your thoughts on all of this stuff in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.